welcome to episode 55 of The Followers. This week we had Eoin Clarkin, who has a wide range of experiences through working with GAA and Soccer and working a bit in the private sector. He's currently balancing two roles as strength and conditioning coach with the Arsenal women's soccer team and with the Irish under-21 men's soccer team. We talked about a load of stuff around the importance of communication, both with your players, but also with the rest of the backroom staff. And because they're drawn from a number of clubs, the importance of communicating with other strength and conditioning coaches and the various things he's learned that way. We spoke about some of the differences, both physically and psychologically, of working with males and with females, and how he's developed some of the softer skills, plus how he's used his experience as a coach of the more technical and tactical elements of soccer and applied them to his strength and conditioning practice. Hope you all enjoy episode 55. Bit of an awkward start to the conversation here when one of Shamrock Rovers' biggest fans logs on and he's met by a Dundalk jersey on, just to try and spice things up from the start. It wasn't going to be all like, oh, we're kind of circling around the ring here trying to eye each other up. It was straight in.
So yeah, thankfully I never hit him with anything I threw from the stand, so there's no bad blood at the moment.
That was part of your background, Eoin, working at Dundalk, but you've had a nice bit of a journey learning from various areas. You want to give us just kind of currently at Arsenal and working with the Irish under-21s, but what was kind of your starting point, how you got into S&C in general?
Yeah, so first of all, thanks for having me on, lads. And I suppose I started off in a bit more of a technical coaching role. I actually started coaching when I was 16 years of age, when I was still playing. I started doing a little bit of local, kind of my Kickstart 1 and my Kickstart 2 badges with the FAI. And I was working in my local club, Mount Marion Football Club, and kind of looking after, I suppose, kids that were kind of between the ages of 4 and 6. So I started right down the bottom of the ladder and worked through my badges, up until I was probably in my early 20s and completed my UEFA B and did various different technical coaching roles, from very much sub-elite to elite level at underage, and right the way through the ladder. I suppose I went on and started working in. I got an opportunity to work with UCD under-19s in the League of Ireland. It could have even been the 20s at the time, and it was just I suppose a role where everyone starts. It was an internship type role. Come in, do a little bit of free work, get some experience. I knew the guy who was looking after the team, the manager, and I suppose things escalated quite quickly from there. Obviously, I took this was more of a sports science S&C type role. A guy called James Timmins, who was a mentor to me at the time, was looking after the first team, and he kind of took me under his wing. And shortly after I'd started with the 19s, he started doing a PhD, and he wanted me to have a little bit more involvement with the first team and help him out there because he was getting quite busy. And within kind of a year or so, he kind of had this, he was stepping away more and more, and I started to take kind of more of a role with the first team and the 19s, I suppose. And not to go through the whole time I was there, but I suppose it ended up, I was there for four or 5 years in UCD, and started kind of with the underage and ended up leading the first team, and then overseeing the whole academy and the first team with some very good kind of strength and conditioning coaches underneath me, and put me into a bit more of a management role. I suppose in that time it was still a part-time role as such, and I was running a business on the side called Advanced Athlete Development, which I started off with a guy called James Egan, and essentially we just saw a little gap in football at the start of essentially the academy teams at elite level, and they had no access to strength and conditioning. So we just started off with 4 to 6 players in a school, and very little resources, and we built it up to kind of a company of 60 plus players, and branched into hockey and rugby, and brought in some really good coaches again, and similar coaches who were working with me at UCD. And at the same time I was also working with Kilmacud Crokes footballers, who James Timmins was also looking after, and he had to step away at his PhD, so I got a little taste of the GAA world, I suppose. And that was brilliant, like really different culturally, and I know I was speaking to you, John, before the podcast, like I think I was very fortunate in the team that I worked with, but from our side of things and just the buy-in to the S&C side of things and the work rate and lads kind of pulling each other in line, it was a really, really good culture to work in. from there, I got an opportunity to work at Dundalk with Stephen Kenny. I was kind of like, I got kind of like a phone call and was asked to do an interview with Dundalk, and I ended up getting the job. And that was brilliant. Spent time there, obviously got experience in European competitions. We won some titles, and again, a really good culture, like similar to the Kilmacud Crokes culture that I was in. Very, very player led. And I didn't spend too long there before I got a phone call to do an interview with Arsenal with the women's team, and that probably brings me to kind of my role and where I am at now. Again, did an interview there and didn't really know what was going to come of it. And to be honest, I actually didn't want to leave Dundalk. I was really enjoying it and was very happy in my life at the time. And but I suppose I think I would have had regret if I didn't come here to do this job. And I was at an age, I think it was 28, 29, and I thought if this opportunity comes any later, I won't take it. So I took it, and I haven't looked back since. And I suppose I've taken up a bit of a dual role in the last year with the Irish under-21s men's team, where I do 5 camps a year with the Irish team as a dual role, and Arsenal have been good enough to kind of allow me to travel out to international camps during the season, as they feel it will benefit me, and I suppose I can bring some ideas back this way, and vice versa. And I suppose the only role I probably left out was I worked in a school for 3 years. In the midst of all that, and again, that was a very football kind of technical role, covering some PE classes as well, and that was again right from boys and girls aged kind of 6 right through to 18. So I probably had a vast range of experience with different ages, different levels, boys, girls, and I suppose that's my background to date.
We really want to dig into the international soccer and Arsenal, but just to look at some of the things you mentioned there, the cultural differences. An awful lot of people say, we've discussed it before, particularly Damien, who's heavily involved in playing GAA and coaching rugby, he notices a big difference between GAA and rugby. You've noticed there, maybe it's because of the teams you're with, you said there weren't huge differences culturally between the GAA teams and the soccer teams you worked with. Was that kind of driven by the individuals themselves? Was it an organisational thing, or do you think it was a little bit bigger or maybe smaller than that?
Yeah, I think I don't want to be harsh on either game or the teams I've worked with, because there's not a team I've looked back on that hasn't been great to work with in different ways. But I think it comes from maybe early days. I think soccer is probably a little bit more of a technical game and has a bit more demand on skills, and as opposed to maybe Gaelic football is still a very skillful game, but also has a high demand on the physical side of the game as well. I think potentially coaches then have focused on doing maybe a lot more running, perhaps at underage level, working the way up. I think there's definitely a difference in one game's professional and one isn't. But I really noticed, I'll go back to my first gym session in Kilmacud Crokes. I was taken back by just the drive, the work ethic. It was a case of pulling the Kilmacud Crokes players back, and potentially sometimes with the footballers, it was pushing them forward. So there was definitely an education piece to the footballers and how the gym side translated onto the pitch. But the GAA boys seemed to already have that, and it was more about slowing them down and educating them how to be a little bit more clever with their training. So, for example, I remember players going, max effort deadlifts into pull-ups, and it was almost a CrossFit style theme when you came in, and you almost had to pull players out and say, look, you need this recovery before you go into your next set. And I think with the soccer players at times, by and large they were very good, but you'd always have 4 or 5 players that you're chasing to get back into the gym to make sure that they'd finish their pull-ups. And there was probably a difference in age group too with the 2 teams I worked with, which is worth noting, is the Kilmacud Crokes lads had an age of 17, 18 up to 35, whereas my UCD team, what I started with, were very young. The Dundalk team probably had a similar kind of cohort in terms of age, but I really noticed the senior players in the GAA group were very comfortable pulling the other players aside and telling them that they needed to finish up what they started in the gym, and that would translate onto their culture, and as they entered the championship, that they needed everyone together and everyone to do all the work, and it was breathtaking. It was brilliant, like to watch. But you also saw a big element of maybe, as I said, that education piece around recovering between sets if we're working on power or maximal strength work.
I suppose there would be Dundalk and Crokes would probably be similar in that way, that there would be a few lads who were like, there would have been a few lads at Crokes who were in the Dublin setup who'd be there to set standards, and similarly I'm sure Dundalk had their talisman in the dressing room as well, who would drag everyone else through as well and set that standard, make sure nobody dropped off.
Yeah, no, that's a fair comparison. I think, look, that Dundalk dressing room was full of a lot of winners and full of a lot of leaders, and definitely had similarities in that regard. There was a slight different probably emphasis on the physicality side to the GAA, but two brilliant dressing rooms to work with.
Current role then with, and we look first at the Irish under-21 team. Like, how does that work? You mentioned there you've kind of 5 camps throughout the season. Are they kind of always the same weekends or the same week every year continuously going forward? So at least like with Arsenal, you can just book them off with whoever you report, manager, chairperson, whatever it works there. And then, like, are you in contact with them throughout those periods, just kind of chatting to them, like the odd WhatsApps, little questionnaire, see, okay, what's your trend load like? Or do you really just, because most of them with clubs, you have to be hands off completely, you're not really allowed to be in communication with them at all?
Yeah, I suppose from the windows that you kind of discussed, the international windows will be set out at the start of each campaign. So, for example, I've got a camp in September, October, November, March and May. And those windows are set in stone with every club. This is the window that players go to on international duty. So that might be a 10-day period. We might opt to use that full 10 days, or depending on the type of camp we have, i.e. is it 1 game, 2 game, is it a friendly, is it a competitive game, we might opt for a 6-day camp. It could be a 5-day camp, it could be a 10-day camp. So we'll kind of make that decision based on usually how many games we have, to be honest, and how much travel we have within that kind of camp. Regards to, I suppose, keeping in contact with the lads, it wouldn't be constant contact, because again you have to respect that when they're with their clubs, and they've got they've got their own physios, sports scientists, S&Cs, coaches, and it could be almost an information overload. And being very honest, I also have my own players here, so I've got to focus on them. But what we tend to do is probably, I suppose, a month before they're coming into camp, myself and the MDT team will be putting an itinerary together. We'll obviously be planning out what hotels we're going to, what type of food we're going to eat, what resources we have. If with COVID the last year it's been tricky, but then getting closer to camps, we're trying to, like, we could have 20 different players from 20 different clubs. Sometimes we've got 2 players from one club, 3 players from one club, but by and large a lot of times they're from different clubs, and that could be a mixture of, like, we've had Premier League players, we've had Championship players, League One, academy players who haven't played first team yet, we've got League of Ireland players. So you've got a massive cohort of, I suppose, people doing different things before they come into camp, different fitness levels. You could have guys returning from injuries. So planning is crucial to how things run on camp. And I suppose the biggest difference between international and club as a practitioner, or particularly in our type of roles, is we're not chasing adaptation on camp with the international group, because ultimately they spend 70 to 80% of their time with their clubs. So ultimately the best way we could affect that is to build a really good relationship with their staff and check in on them, and if we see something on camp in our screening or our data, can we tie it together? But realistically they're going to make those changes, and our job when they get in camp with us is to ensure they're fresh and they peak for these key games that we have, and that they recover in between those games and how they recover. So I think it's really important that we're not chasing adaptation in these 10-day blocks, because we've had players in that in a 2-month cycle from the last time they were with us or less, they've played 10 games. They played 2 games a week for that whole time. So sometimes they're tired, and we've got to freshen them up a little bit, and then obviously get them right for our games. So we tend to, as I said, building relationships with other sports scientists and strength and conditioning coaches at their clubs is really important. The player comes first, so if they see that we're doing right by their player when they're in camp with us, I suppose it works both ways. And coming into camp, we usually ask for certain things to find out roughly where they're at. So we may have our analyst with our international team will track match minutes between the two camps. So how many minutes have they played since the last time they were with us, and in that kind of time frame. We'll also ask for that information from their sports scientist, who usually they're very, very good at handing that stuff over. We try to get an idea of their weekly volumes since the last time they were with us. So we look for total distance in terms of their GPS. We look for some sort of intensity markers, so whether that's sprint distance or their max Vs. Again, we would like to know particularly what they're doing the week before they come in, but what they've done potentially the month before they come in as well. And then we try to get some information like gym programs, if they have any individual work, some isometric work, are they managing any previous injuries or have just returned from injury. So we try not to make it too complex because, as I said, you've got 20 different players and you're getting all this data, and you've got to be very realistic of what you can do with it practically. But our first day on camp, or it sometimes could be before camp, I'll present that to the management team to say, this is where I think the players are at in terms of fitness. This is the last time they played. So for example, their first day training with us is at match day +2, 1, 3, 4. And obviously we'll tie in different things like wellness and screening on camp. But we really are just looking to get a snippet of what have they done since they were last with us? How do they currently feel? Are they fit? Are they match fit? Have they been playing games? Have they been playing first team games? Have they been playing academy games? And that gives us a status of where our squad are at when they come in.
How many backroom staff would actually go to an international camp at under 21 level? And even then, like from your knowledge, how many be on a senior camp in Ireland anyway?
Off the top of my head, I don't know. But I'm going to say around 15.
Yeah, it's a good few people to like manage communication with, and there's a lot of like potential demands there that a manager has to like, okay, I have to listen to everyone, but at the end of the day, I still have to decide what's happening here.
So when you were saying their own, so I suppose you'd have then a snapshot when you present to the management team, this is where the guys are at fitness-wise. Would you liaise back to, say, individuals, S&C coaches, or at the clubs, if you had a good relationship, to say, like, let's say player A isn't really at the fitness mark that the rest of the under-23 squad are at? Just see, like, obviously you're not telling them how to do their job, but just so they know in their head, if he's looking to get to this level, he's kind of a bit off the mark.
Absolutely. Like, I think it's a difficult one because I've had it with players in recent times there where my manager might say, look, this is a player we're looking to bring into camp, maybe the week before or 2 weeks before, and say, I've noticed he hasn't been playing many games for his club, but I still think, I'd really like him in my squad. Can you go do some digging on where he's at from a fitness point of view? He's probably not absolutely match fit, but is he even going to be able to come in and help us in camp if I need to bring him on for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, etc. So yeah, I've had many like phone calls with kind of sports scientists or S&Cs from different clubs to try to find that information out, and it's quite a challenging position because you're asking them to be really honest with you, and they might have a really good relationship with that player and they don't want to be the person who stands in the way of them getting an international cap, but ultimately they also have that kind of professionalism about them that they don't want to send you a player that's not fit and is going to break down. So I found it, the guys I've spoke to or the girls I've spoke to at different clubs have been really honest and helpful in that way, and it definitely gives us a bit more context to their situation, because we've had it both ways. Sometimes they haven't played many games and then they come in, but they've done a lot of work and the guys have managed them really well at club and they're well able to come on for 20-30 minutes for us, and they could be a goal scorer to someone that we need to come off the bench. And we've also had it the other way where we've actually brought guys in and they haven't been there. So it's again that communication piece is that really important, that if you didn't have that conversation, you're not going to be as well prepped for the big game.
In terms of gym work, like obviously they're all going to be coming with entirely different gym sessions or gym programs, and over the course of 10 days, like they probably want to be getting a few sessions in. Is that a case where you kind of have to, in a sense, stand back and just ask them, will you have yours? Do you know what it is? And trust them to do it. And at the same time, like there could still be clubs out there that don't have a strong gym culture, and you're there trying to get them to do some bit without throwing a load at them, so they end up getting loads of bad DOMs just because they're not used to lifting or going through any kind of big load and anything like that.
Absolutely. I think it's been particularly challenging throughout COVID, because I'd say if I take our last 5 camps, I'd say 4 of those camps we didn't have access to a gym. It was just closed off. There was gyms in the hotels we were using, but we didn't have access to a gym. So the clubs are really good at sending on programs. I don't personally believe I should be changing any of those programs. Like, these guys are working on they know the player better. They're performing this program throughout the entire year. So it makes absolutely no sense for me to start reprogramming or changing things. And as you said, if there's a player who doesn't get loaded at club, the last thing I want to do is load him at international where he's got two big games. And being really honest, it's very difficult because we usually have 2 or 3 games in a short period of days. So even their normal gym program is hard to, it probably needs to be modified in some way. And again, without a gym, we've probably had to look at different ways of doing it. So whether that's Nordics post-game, so then they can recover after, or whether that's some isometric work that we have to do during the week, that's going to probably cause less DOMs, and probably footballers buy into it a little bit more in that sense if you can sell them that piece. But essentially, we do ask the clubs at the start, what would you like them to do on camp? Here's our schedule. Where do you think that fits into your plan? So if they're used to normally loading post-game, so they can then recover between that game and the next game, we'll do our best to try and manage those individual programs and load them. And if the player can do it themselves, we'll give them the ownership to do it themselves. And like every team and like every sport, some players are better than others, and I try to stay on top of as much as possible, but I'm not chasing every single player, because I've got, you know yourselves, you've got a million things to do each day, and they've got to take responsibility for some of that too. So yeah, it's very, very difficult, but I 100% wouldn't be going changing programs at all. If someone wants to come in and is looking for some extra, maybe core or trunk work or some upper body stuff or mobility, no problem. But not with their lower limb loading. We tend to let the clubs program that.
And then I suppose you will see everyone's program, I suppose, just from communicating with the S&C coaches. At that under 23s level, it may be at some clubs there mightn't be as strong an S&C presence as you'd expect at senior in a different sport. Kind of seeing them across, is there like the right things cropping up in everyone's thing? Like, is there a red thread, or is there still, obviously you don't have to name names, but is there kind of place where you like where that is a gap?
Yeah, I think, look, there's a lot of different types of programs, but overall I'd like to think that the level of practitioner, like majority of our players play in the UK, right now you've got the EPPP and you've got standards in place that there's a certain level of practitioner in these positions. So by and large, there hasn't been anything massive that stood out to me. That's been a huge red flag. And again, it's just, who am I to say it's a red flag? I think it's as I said, they know that player better. They know why they have it in. I 100% don't have the time to sit with every single one of them and say, why do you have this in? So I'm trusting the practitioners that manage them at their club, and I think resources is probably a bigger issue. Potentially, you might find that the League of Ireland boys and the lads who manage the guys at League of Ireland are brilliant, like really, really good, but ultimately they don't have the resources of some of the big clubs in England. And then same, not even just the League of Ireland, we might have some boys in League 1, League 2 who've just maybe have just got GPS or don't have GPS, and that tends to be a bit more of a challenge at times. But the practitioners themselves overall have been brilliant to deal with, you know.
You mentioned there, when you're on camp, you're not really looking for adaptation. You're not looking to make players fitter. It's about recovery, freshness, and like, I assume ultimately from a manager and more tactical coach's point of view, you're trying to blend together your squad through a system of play. It takes, and the same with getting the players to use programs and stuff in their club, that takes a certain amount of humility on your own behalf to just stand back and be like, I'm here in an awful lot of ways to facilitate them continuing with their normal work than me trying to put a stamp on. And I'd say it can also be hard that you're trying, in a way, not to impress the manager. Like, it'd be so easy to go and say, I'm going to show the manager and show all the players, it's going to be the best session of all time, I'm going to have them like buzzing about the place, and then 36 hours later they're absolutely wrecked for their game. That it, like, you know, there has to be a certain element of trust between you, the manager, the coaches. Like, yeah, we're getting this lad in because he knows his stuff and how to manage it all, not because he's going to come in and do this one great session, because a great session there is keeping them fresh.
Yeah, it's very difficult, and I think in our industry, I don't know if you boys agree, I might ask you after this, but sometimes we're getting a reputation for pulling back, capping a session, you can't do this is too much. And maybe the culture is going that way, maybe the jobs specs going a little bit that way, because where there becomes this big pressure around injuries, and we know there's hundreds of variables that can lead to an injury, but external load seems to be the one that everyone points out. I think we've got to show one at international level, you probably tend to be doing that role a little bit more, where you're trying to wrap them up and make sure they're okay. Whereas when you're chasing that adaptation in certain phases of club, you're trying to push. So I think we've got to show the management team that we're willing to do both. And I think a story I kind of look back on was, I think it was 2 or 3 sessions in a row, I had told a previous manager I'd worked with that, I think we need to stop here, or it's maybe a little bit too high with the game being on this day, and I could see a frustration building within the manager, and ultimately it's their decision. So I made sure the next day when we had a working day that we got to a point, and he kind of looked at me and said, "Do you think this is too much?" I think, and he was getting this kind of feeling maybe we should stop. And it was a time where I could show him that no, we can push, and that's not necessarily also always based off the GPS that day. But I knew the adaptation we were trying to chase. So my answer to him was to add a set, or to add 2 sets, and I think that gave him the trust that when I felt it was right, from the objective data I had and the time of the week and what we were trying to get, I was willing to push. But when I felt it was the other way, I would also pull back and help guide in that way. And I think when you can show a manager that, that's huge, because I think we are starting to get a little bit of a reputation for maybe wrapping players up because of and potentially I feel that could be around people's anxieties for their job and injury rates.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. That it is creeping in, and I would generally err on the side of a higher training load than a lower training load. But that's often to just appease the people around you who just say that, we want to work them really hard. So, like I just generally like keeping a slightly higher chronic training load. I think players in GAA anyway tend to just prefer that. They feel like, we've worked harder, we are more prepared. I think managers, certainly in GAA, much prefer seeing that as well. But it is something you certainly have to strike a balance with. And then I think when you do come in and say, 40 minutes into a session and players are bait from something, and then you say, I think we need to cut it here, I think they respect it far more than if you're constantly like, I don't know, we're going too hard, I don't know, we're going too hard here. When you do kind of push a little bit more, and then the odd time you stop it, it's possibly a little bit more respected. Just on one thing you mentioned there about loading after games, can you just tell us what you mean by that, and then kind of some examples of it maybe?
Yeah, so I suppose we would have some players going back to, club and country, I suppose, that may want to get an extra strength session done during the week. So if we have 1 game week, they might, not they might want, we might want them to get an extra strength session done during the week. Particularly players who maybe broke down in the past with, I suppose, say a hamstring issue, for example. We might look to do like a modified strength session after the game, even if they've played significant minutes. So that could be some isometric hamstring work. Obviously exercises that are feasible to do and practical to do on the day. And I suppose the reason we load them there is because we want them to start the recovery cycle straight after that game. So if they can load up after the game, they've got 1 big hit, and then they can recover between that and the next game or the next big session. And then likewise on a 2-game week, you might find that you can't get a lower body strength session done at all during the week of training. So that might be, we might look to microdose some of the training stimulus across the 2 games and make sure that we're keeping those tissues strong and healthy. Because like looking at our club schedule coming up this year, we have nearly 2 game weeks every single week. So all this good work that we've done in pre-season to build them up and strengthen them, it's going to be very hard to maintain if we don't put any strength work into their weekly plan. And then I suppose likewise on loading on the game side of things with subs, we'll try and get a lot of speed exposure work done the night of the game as well. So we'll always have a non-playing group session that week But we want to keep our kind of high speed exposure as far away from our next big session or game as possible. So it's the same principle. You tend to get 30 minutes, 15 minutes, depending on where you are, on the side of a pitch or on the pitch, and you're limited in what you can do. So we tend to just make sure they get a good warm up and they get some speed exposure during the week, and that might be a game load of high speed running. So we know we've, I suppose, essentially ticked that box, and then the following day or the day after, depending on what day we train, we might have a small group that will focus more on the football side, so small side of games, and we might do some different types of running, but it's a bit safer to do closer to our next big session or our next big game.
That kind of post-game load and stuff, so that they're tired from the match, but you still want to give them as much time as possible going into the next match they're about to play, therefore doing the strength as soon as possible after. Like, you don't always need to be as fresh as possible going to a lower body strength session. It's largely to keep what you have there. But if you have a game Sunday and Wednesday, if you're going in doing wait until Tuesday morning to do a gym session where you're a bit fresher, there's going to be a little bit of fatigue there still going into Wednesday night's game, whereas just match Sunday, gym straight afterwards, you've loads of recovery time to get into the next game. I think I would have heard that quite a bit. NBA players do that quite a bit, and baseball players, they finish a game straight into the gym and then give themselves as much recovery time as possible from game to game, but that's about the only way they can keep strength levels topped up.
Yeah, exactly.
And then the high speed stuff for subs and that, is that probably because it's when they're at their absolute freshest, so it's probably the best time to get some speed work in, again without the knock-on effect of fatigue at the far end?
Yeah, exactly. And I think, look, it's a tough one sometimes, because like even seasonal differences can make such a difference. Like coming in here in September at the start of the season, very, very easy. You get into December and January in Britain or Ireland, and it's cold, and you've got subs who haven't played and they're pissed off, and you've limited time on the pitch and you've got to run them. You've got to make sure that they're warmed up right if they're going to be doing speed exposure work, so, and then you've also got to manage the personalities in the dressing room as well. And there is a time and a place, in my opinion, that it might not be done, because if someone's been sitting on the bench for 4 or 5 weeks, there's a time and a place sometimes to just kind of manage that personality, and you'll get something back for that as well.
Just lastly on the international stuff, when you're away on camp, can it be hard sometimes? I'm going to assume not for yourself, because you probably have loads to be doing, but sometimes can it be hard to facilitate filling time for players? Like, how do you balance just giving them time to themselves, but at the same time worrying, like, they've actually had 22 hours completely to themselves here. We need to give them some kind of activities that won't tire them out, just with some kind of stimulation there for themselves.
Yeah, I think it's been really difficult, again, throughout that COVID period, where in the past you might go to a really nice city and the lads can go out for a coffee and see the sights or walk down to the beach, depending on where you're at. Like, you're now almost isolated to your hotel, which can instill kind of a sense of cabin fever. It can instill a sense of you're kind of going from recoveries or training or screening to a training session to a meeting to a recovery session to another meeting to video analysis to individual work. It's very difficult, I think, to ensure that kind of mental freshness. And we've tried. You always find when you get a new group in, they're not shy, but they don't know each other as well. And when you get a new group, a new campaign, and as you get through the campaign, they start to know each other better. Like, the lads have been great at playing kind of different games and card games, and they've been quite good. But I still feel we're missing something from talking to players, and that's not just my players at Ireland, but maybe even my players at Arsenal, because we have something like 12 different nationalities, so they're essentially in 12 different camps, and I think they just find it a long time, and it's a lot of mental stimulus, doing tactical work with the tactical coaches, doing recovery with me, then they're in with the physios. Like, it's a lot of information they're getting, and potentially sometimes an information overload, and trying to get that balance right is tough. And I think it's been even more challenging throughout the last year with COVID, but I think that probably goes for everyone in every situation,
And even then, if you're doing stuff to like try and get them to bond or play games or that, it can be so easy to force that, or for the players to feel like it's forced, that you know, like you as, or I assume the manager anyway, doesn't want to feel like can't give them too much free time now. They won't know what to do with themselves, and sometimes you can just fill it up too. I feel a schedule too full, and players are like, oh, not another build a human pyramid with people I don't want to see again. Like,
yeah, it's probably that balance of forced fun and actual fun and relaxing, because like the last trip we were on in Spain was brilliant because we changed something small. So we used to pencil in the meals as breakfast, lunch, dinner. It could be pre-match, post-match, and then snacks was one of the ones that kind of you drip fed in to just fill the gap, I suppose. But instead of doing that this time, we created like a snack room, and it just allowed the players to, one, when they felt hungry, they take, I suppose, responsibility for that. But two, the snack room became a little bit of a hangout place where they could just chill. They could go in. We were obviously in Spain, so there was a lovely balcony and a great view, and it overlooked kind of a golf course. So they went in and relax. And I think creating different rooms like that is brilliant. Like something we're looking at in the next one, and we probably kind of have it as we've got like a recovery room, but it's essentially the physio room that people gather around. But I was thinking, like, could you create something like a recovery room that you essentially book an extra room in a hotel, and it's almost a relaxation room that people. So if you have your snack room where you're talking, you can have a bit of crack, or there might be a table tennis table or a games room or that type of thing. But your recovery room's a little bit more. You've obviously got your, like, you know, your recovery pumps in there, your game readies. You've got mats, you've got foam rollers, but you also have a room that's a bit more, I suppose, tranquil. Lads can stick on if they want to, like the kind of mindfulness apps. You don't have to come in and speak. You can rest, and something around that piece I think could be really nice. So we're not just looking at physical recovery, we're looking at the mental side of things as well. And sometimes I find these international camps, you're constantly with people. So you're talking to people at breakfast, then you're screening, you're talking to players. Sometimes you just want a bit of your own space, I think, and to set up something that facilitates that is something that we are looking into at the minute. But I think it's a missing piece to the recovery side of things.
Sometimes if you've a few more naturally introverted players, that constant being around people can just fatigue them so much, and they're nearly looking forward to get back to their club, so they just go and hide in their room for a few days. Even as well, little things like just having a coffee machine somewhere. It could just be a little hub where people gather and, like, you know, mess around with making a coffee if they're into their fancy coffees or something like that. Just to, you know, it's a place to go, and if I'm in the humour to chat to someone, there's probably someone there. If there isn't, I can just go hang out in my room. You mentioned there about your day-to-day job at Arsenal. Sorry, did you say 12 or 14 different nationalities?
Don't quote me. Last year I think we had 10 or 11 different nationalities. So we're up around that number. Yeah, probably between 10 and 11 different nationalities anyway.
And similar to when you're contacting clubs, do you get that in the same direction back? Like around, like, okay, just off the top of my head, Finland are having a camp, does the Finnish S&C give you a shout being like, okay, this player here, is she, or what's her game going like, and like that? Or do you notice a massive difference across countries and how they approach it?
Yeah, I think there is definitely a big difference. There's a disparity between countries. And that's people in general. I think, like, you've some that are brilliant communicators, some that maybe don't communicate as well. They want to do things their own way on camp. You've got different ways of doing things. You've got, you know, for a simple example, some of the European clubs are much more into heart rate response, whereas a lot of the maybe UK based clubs can be more into maybe GPS and external load, which are probably two completely different things really. But they chase different types of data. Yeah, and I think, like everyone, you definitely find some are a bit more proactive in terms of when they contact you, but we try control at our end too. So we set our own standards in the sense of, if they're going off on camp, usually we play a game on a Sunday, and they'll go off on camp either that Sunday after the game, depending on when their international team wants them in, or they'll go that Monday. So we just have a big day that Sunday. So usually if it's an away game on the way back, and to be fair, Fran Silver, who's the other strength and conditioning coach who works with me, he tends to do a lot more of the sports science side of things, and he's brilliant in that sense of, we make sure that night every single country has what they need from our end of things. So we don't really wait for them to chase us. We just get in the front foot, and the reason we wait till that day is because our last bit of data is the game, and then we want to give them an update on where they're physically at post game, but the medical team will chip in with that too. So we'll always make sure we get our reports out. And the reason we do that, one, is obviously first and foremost to manage the player. But two, we want that information back to manage the player when they come back to us. So we kind of say, look, we're always going to get things out to you early. We'd really appreciate getting it back after your last game.
And from different countries looking for different, whether it be external or internal stuff, is there anything you've started looking at extra? Because these 8 countries all want to see such and such. Have you then might be worth just looking at to see, or are you still just, these are the main things that we find work, we're going to stick with that for now?
Probably heart rate response, to be honest. I think working in the past, I've had teams that potentially don't like wearing the heart rate straps. So, and then maybe it isn't enforced by the management. So they'll take the heart rate strap and one or two will throw it on the ground, and if the management don't back you there, it's just not. Sometimes it's not a fight worth fighting, because if it's every day you're spending energy trying to get a heart rate strap onto someone, you'd rather spend your time doing something else, and it has to come from the top down. So I suppose this year with Arsenal, we've straps on them in every single session, and we're trying to monitor the response to the training load that we've kind of set out. So we're building up for a Champions League 2-game week, and we've worked back from that in terms of what the external load we're looking to hit in those games, or the worst case scenarios. We've stepped that back to week 1, and then are now working forward again. But the heart rate gives us another piece of how the players are responding to that load, and yeah, it's been really interesting. I'm still learning a lot about it, how much it does correlate to that, but I've definitely seen some nice trends, stuff that you'd already know. But players who, we've had a player we've signed from a team that were still in the in-season, and she's already fit, and you can see she's responding really well to the training. And then likewise, we've had another player who had a really long off-season and took her rest, and likewise we can see that across our data. So it's really nice looking at it for, I suppose, in our drill database. If we do something like 1v1s, 2v2s, 3v3s that might not necessarily drive huge output in terms of meters per minute, in terms of an external load, you can have quite a high heart rate response, which again you'll know from the research if you read it. But it is good to just see these trends and build your own little profiles, and we've a new manager that's just come in, and like our previous manager, they want to condition through the game as much as possible. So for me, if you're going to condition through the game, having as much objective data as you can to feed back to the management team is really important. And I think in football you need to be prepared to be able to facilitate that as a practitioner, because there's a huge amount of managers who will want to go, I suppose, through that tactical periodization model.
It's a good way to kind of build a relationship, I think, with a head coach as well, as if they are all for conditioning through the sport, to kind of get it out there off the first bat that, like, I'm not against that, but you just have to make sure there's certain things we have to hit, and then by all means add a ball to it. Just make sure that you're hitting my criteria, and you can do whatever else added stuff you want.
Yeah, exactly. And I think for me there's a real battle between the tactical and the physical. Like if you have them on either end of the spectrum, you've got physical here and tactical here. I think where you introduce more tactical information or constraints in the game, you lose something physical, and where you go pure physical, i.e. running, you're going to lose tactical information. So again, you've got a new manager that comes in, he wants to get a lot of tactical information across the players, he's got minimal amount of time, but then we're in our bias looking at it and going, well, if they're not physically prepped, they're not going to be able to perform those tactical or technical actions, particularly under fatigue late in games. So that's a real bias that sits within each department, but it's about coming together for what's best for the team, and having those conversations and meetings and making it a collaborative approach and saying, right, but if we're going to go through the game with a passing drill or a small sided game or a possession drill, how does that look? What are the things that might hinder the physical side of things if we're in pre-season and that's what we're trying to push. So I think those conversations are really important, and we've had it recently where we have to review those processes constantly. But yeah, I'm still learning on that side of things, and being able to track the external load and the meters per minute and heart rate response. Even if coaches go into that mode of you want a 2-minute break between the two drills, but they've spent time now talking for 5, they're the little things that make a difference. And understanding what they are is very, very important to how you plan out your pre-season.
That can make conditioning through a game so difficult. Like, you're there, can we just, you're begging them like a week in advance, when we play this game, can we just get 3 solid 5-minute blocks? And if something breaks down, just write it down and address it afterwards. But please don't stop the game. Just let it run through. And then you're halfway through the second game. The coach is like, come on, will you look at me for a second? That's not the way I want to pass. And you're like, we're going to have to play another 5-minute block now. We're going to have to do some kind of top-ups or something here. But even just encouraging the coach to have a pen and paper and give yourself 3 points that you can address at the end. Otherwise, just leave them at it, please.
And it's really funny, like, because I tend to be doing, in my position, 2 different things at international and club level. Like, well, I suppose right now you're trying to push that physical side, and then when we're away, I'm almost going to the coach, you could step in, like, I'm almost saying, like, well, if you stepped into that drill 3 times, you'll take the sting out of it, you'll take the intensity out of it. And he wants to get as much tactical information as he can, because we've got a short window of time with international stuff. So your bias at the international is going, come on, step in again, take the sting out of it. We're match day -2 or match day -1, and at club, when you're in that other phase of pre-season, you're, like you're saying, the polar opposite. You're going, please don't step in, just don't step in, or if you step in, it has to be quick. But look, we don't know what wins us games, and I think sometimes coaches might start working on set pieces and we don't think that's the right thing for that given day. But our first game of the season, we go in and we score 2 headers. Game's over, 30 minutes into the game. Like, it's very hard to know what's right, and ultimately football is a technical and tactically dominant game. You absolutely have to be fit enough and to perform these actions, and it definitely helps in the later stages of games, and it can win you games, I think. But you also have to be technically and tactically at it to win games, and that might win you more games over a season. So I think we have to take our bias hat off and at times and understand what needs to happen and when, and ultimately, you've said the word, John, throughout this, is we facilitate. We're not in positions where we actually make those calls. We can only educate and communicate our ideas and why we think they're good for the team, but ultimately it's not our decision in the end of the day.
That information then going into you from other clubs becomes so important, on knowing their base fitness levels, because as you said, like the manager, like your role with Ireland, obviously you're looking for mainly on recovery, whereas the head coach potentially has to get a whole new way of playing football across to someone in 3-4 days. So they don't have time to give them run a fitness test, then give them a day off, and then go into tactical stuff. They have to rely on that data coming through efficiently. Absolutely,
and it's sometimes about, like, my manager at Ireland at the minute, Jim Crawford, he's brilliant. Like, he really buys into this side of things. So sometimes we've got to manage a player. I know we've gone back to Ireland now, but sometimes we've got to manage a player, individually. We say, right, we need to get him right for this game, and he might only feature for 30 minutes, but ultimately he won't be able to perform this training load pre-game. So where do we modify him throughout the week to make sure that he's still fresh for these minutes and he's not getting, I suppose, a spike in his training load overall, and we send him back to his club? And that could be as simple as putting a player in as a neutral player. It doesn't mean you have to take them out of the session. Again, you have to know what a modification looks like and how you suggest that to a manager, because you don't want to be, again, that practitioner that's pulling players all the time, because that practically doesn't work for an international manager when they're preparing for camp. So you've got to think of clever ways where he's an outside player, he's a neutral, and he might come out and work with me for a little bit, but he's still getting touches. We've got to be up our skill set as well to suggest these ideas, I think. But yeah, it's difficult at times as well.
And when you first came to the Ireland setup, did you come in under Stephen, or did you only come in with Jim?
Oh, I came in with Jim. Stephen did actually. I don't know how much, but Stephen did. Stephen did call me to put me into the role, I suppose, or to offer me the role, and said Jim was on board with it, and so I suppose I was appointed by Stephen and Jim. Yeah, and Jim.
I was just thinking it'd be interesting to see, like, if you saw much of a change between Stephen when you had him day to day as a club manager, when he had more control, as opposed to on the international stage. So I'd say it's such a big transition for him. Like, people will be like, you manage a team, but like that's a completely different ball game with the load and the amount of time you get with players.
I'll tell you if I get there.
When?
Yeah, when, yeah.
At Arsenal currently, with Arsenal ladies, but obviously or women's, I'm just used to saying ladies football, I haven't worked with a lot of male teams in the past, Kilmacud Crokes, Dundalk, Irish Underage. Physically, what are some of the differences that you have to plan around or plan for when it comes to conditioning the Arsenal team?
So I suppose the obvious, or maybe not obvious, but the physical differences between male and females that often pop up are, I think in recent times there's a lot of talk around the menstrual cycle. You've obviously got kind of relative energy deficiency, or the female athlete triad, if you know, kind of that kind of piece around fueling and bone density that can affect bone density and potentially lead to kind of stress fractures. And then the other one that's massively talked about, I suppose, as well, is prevalence of ACL in the women's game is higher. So I suppose we come at it from a few different angles. From the ACL side of things, I suppose football is obviously it's a multi-directional game. It has I think Damien Harper did a piece on a presentation or a webinar recently on kind of, it was like the highest D cells to X cells ratio. Football was one of the highest sports that kind of sat in that area. I think it was like 1.7 times more D cells than X cells. So I hope I've got that right. So I think that piece around coaching, you know, landing mechanics, deceleration mechanics, change of direction is important. So from a movement side of things, and then also measuring it, you know, how do we measure it? It's always been a tricky one to measure it. So whether that's using the force platform, whether that's using the GPS and looking at max intensity or max velocity decelerations, and kind of making sure we're looking at that from a training load point of view. Screening to start with, like, are we screening for this? You know, are we looking at kind of knee valgus? Does it happen during dynamic movement? So we try and video all our jumps. So any jumps we do that may be looking at from a performance point of view, we also look at the landing profile and how that looks single leg and double leg. Another one that's probably highlighted a lot is kind of quad to hamstring balance. So again, making sure there's enough posterior chain work within their program, and trying to measure that in some way. So we use a machine called NIKD, which can measure that, but also just looking at their program in terms of, like, if they're doing a single leg knee extension and another hamstring based movement, you know, what does their strength look like across those two exercises? Maximal strength work is important, I think, for just adaptations of different tissue qualities, so strengthening tendons, ligaments, muscle. And then I think with the female athlete, but definitely not just the female athlete, the single leg focus and the focus around stability is really important. So having more single leg work in, we tend to. And having a focus on each lift, I think something myself and Fran at Arsenal spoke about recently is kind of, you've got 20 different players in the gym and they're all off doing different programs. We individualise all our programs. We kind of split the team into two groups of 10 and program 10 players each to give it a little bit more detail. And I'll probably going off on a little bit of a tangent from what your question, but we kind of look at lifting heavy, lifting fast and lifting well. And I think you want a combination of all of them all the time. So it's not to say you don't, but giving a player a focus on an exercise. So when they're doing maximal strength work, they're lifting heavy. When they're doing more explosive based work like a trap bar jump, they're lifting fast. And when they're doing a single leg exercise, maybe a single leg squat off a box, they're really focusing on lifting well. Now obviously there's a crossover with all that and we want to be doing all of them all the time, but sometimes giving a player one key focus is really important, and making sure that if they're doing maximal strength work, it actually is maximal strength work. And we've used VBT, velocity based training, quite a bit this year to track velocity, so telling them to have maximal intent in each exercise and tracking for strength work, and giving them, you know, band zones of what meters per second they should be moving. And if they get above that meters per second, so for example, if that's 5 meters per second, if they get above that, add weight to the bar. And then same with their velocity work or their power work, doing the same thing. But I've gone off a little tangent from probably the kind of question you asked.
No, I think it's actually an important point to make, because I think when we go into the next question, I think it actually ties it together really well. So that was a perfect point to make.
Yeah, and I think on the relative energy deficiency and the fueling side of things probably doesn't fall into my area as much now, because we've got a nutritionist with us with Arsenal. So Steph Ridley's her name, and she looks after all the fueling and recovery side of things in terms of nutritional input. But to be honest, last year Steph's just come on board in a more full-time role this year. So last year we did step in and give some advice, and obviously around the area of kind of relative energy deficiency and fueling and making sure players are properly fueled. There's been, and I won't name names, but there's been some studies I know have done recently that have kind of shown that the female athletes at an elite level have been under fueled for competition. And as we know, there's that piece around bone density and stress fractures. Even from that side of things, it's not only is it important that they're fueled to perform, it's also important they're fueled for that they don't get injured. And it's something that I know our nutritionist looks very closely at when players are looking to improve body composition or drop body fat. I think they've got to be a little bit more careful than their male athletes, in the sense of dropping their calorie intake too fast could potentially lead to something else, such as a stress fracture further down the line. So we use the DEXA scan to kind of track that, and that's another really important piece around the female athlete. And then the menstrual cycle, being very, very honest, like we track it. The players kind of fill in that information on their wellness kind of questionnaire each day, what in terms of what phase they're on. But practically, we're probably not in a position yet where we've made modification based on training. I think particularly out in the pitch, it's not very practical if someone's a certain phase and they might be feeling fatigue, or I don't think we're in a position yet to start changing drills, or I don't think we ever will be, to be honest. But we have one of our physios, actually, before the nutritionist came in, Rose Glendenning, she came up with a really nice kind of presentation which she put together, listened to a lot of podcasts and some of the research around nutritional interventions at different phases. So, if inflammation is high during a certain phase, there was a certain type of smoothie that you could eat that might help with tackling, with anti-inflammatory foods that might help with tackling that inflammation. So it was based around a different smoothie for each phase, with different ingredients. It was a really simple, nice idea. So she came up with a really nice one there. So that's really what we're doing in terms of that side of things.
It's just to give ourselves on the podcast two plugs, the two previous episodes. We had Eamon Maguire on, Shucks to Tipperary footballers. Her PhD studies have highlighted that the red S, not quite as prevalent in males, but it is there, and something we certainly need to be mindful of when working with teams. But the added complication of the menstrual cycle does make it that bit more, I won't say worrisome, but something we certainly need to be aware of in females. And then we Kelly McNulty on, she's doing her PhD on the impact of the menstrual cycle on exercise performance, exercise adaptation. I would assume it's some of her podcasts, period to period, that your physio listened to, and she even had an excellent one with, I think, Renee McGregor, who was really focusing on like nutrition around the menstrual cycle. That was largely looking to physical differences, and you touched there on having specific intent in one of three categories when doing all the lifts. And something I wanted to ask about was some of the psychological differences you've noticed between male and female athletes. I've always found that they really want to know more about why are we doing this, why are we doing that. Giving them that specific intent, was that because they kept asking you and you said, do you know, if they're so eager to know, this is a great chance to give a specific focus on why? Or was it largely because they really wanted to know and that was your best way of addressing that?
Yeah, I think on that one, probably did fall into the why category a little bit, but I feel like that wouldn't be specific to a female athlete for me. It's more management of a huge number of athletes across, a gym session. How can I ensure? I think it comes back to feedback for me. So it's a chance for an athlete to be competitive and get instant feedback without a coach having to be beside them. And the why PCS probably is rationalising the understanding of why they're doing it for sure. But we saw that intent increased just visually by looking at your coach and I. We could see across the room that once they knew why, they got feedback and they're athletes, so they're going to be competitive. You can see a lot more intent, and it kind of almost structures your session that we're getting more bang for our buck. So it's something that if I have access to it, and the previous clubs I haven't had access to it, but I know even like Output Sports have put together a great package there as well now. It's something that I don't think is the be all and end all. I think we've got to be very careful with technology and how it can sometimes take us away from the human side of things and the coaching side of things. So it needs to work well, that piece of technology. But it's a piece that I definitely like and enjoy. And I suppose just to answer your other question, differences I've seen psychologically in between, I agree with you. I think that was my first one. Like we just phrase it as the power of why, and it just challenges us as practitioners to rationalise everything we do. So we turn it into a positive that, there is times we can go, why are they asking me again? But really it's because they're interested, and when they're interested and they know why, they really do commit to it. Female athletes I've found, and we try and go into everything and rationalise it before they do. But look, inevitably it always comes back with different questions, but embrace it and it will help you, I think, develop yourself. Something else I've seen, and it is also, I wrote a piece for Greg Bennett, another Irish strength and conditioning coach recently, and I wrote it with two practitioners from Arsenal. We wrote it together, and something that has popped up in the research and I've noticed as well is like female athletes tend to have a greater desire to create and maintain kind of close relationships. So I think that coach-athlete relationship is vital to buy-in almost. They tend to want to be part of the process a little bit more and have that kind of democratic environment where it's a together approach, and involving them in their programming. Like if they prefer a squat over a trap bar deadlift, and you just want a maximal strength, multi-joint, multi-muscle movement in, give them the trap bar deadlift, unless you've got a specific reason not to. Allow them to be involved in, I'd say that's for all athletes, but really with the female athlete, allow them to be part of the process and allow them build it with you, and I think you get more back.
I think that's an excellent point. I actually heard, I can't remember his name, but a very well respected Aussie rules coach who worked in male and female sport over the years. I was asked what's the difference, and he said males need to play well to feel like they belong, whereas females need to feel like they belong to play well. And that ties in exactly what you were saying there. They value the relationships more with the coach, but also with teammates, and they kind of need to they need to be integrated more before they can perform, whereas males are often the opposite way. They start performing well and then feel like, oh, I'm part of it now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's probably that soft skill, emotional intelligence side of things. I think it is more important potentially in the women's game, but I also think going back to the men's game with Ireland, I've tried to use that as I've developed that area, and I also realise that the male athlete also needs it. I think we're probably, we've got 20 people or 25 players, there's 25 individual personalities there, and some will need it more than others, and some will need it less. But yeah, I think all people need it. But I have found that as a difference between the two.
Yeah, excellent point. Just touching back to, you say you've individualized gym programs. When you're doing that, are they like completely individual, or do you kind of have a general template in your head that you work off and then just slightly individualize certain parts within? Just to save yourself time in your own brain to not be like coming up with 20 completely individual programs.
Yeah, I think we've got a model. You've got to work off first. So you probably start with your model, and then, as you said, you just take little different pieces. So it might be a case of, we want to work on, as I said, maximal strength. We want something in that kind of power region, we want something single leg, so that might start you off as your base. We'll have a kind of exercise matrix like a lot of teams do, where this is our end goal, this is where we start. So if you get a player in who's a very low training age, they might start earlier on in the pathway and work their way up. I suppose then going back to the training age, you might have players who can handle, high eccentric loading and players who can't. So do you focus on movement first? Yes, and then you might move them along the pathway to focus more on force and force outputs, and then we look at their data, like we look at their screening and see, where are they strong, where are they weak relative to the team? Is there asymmetries between the two legs? Like I said earlier, is there different ratio between hamstring and quad? Can we add an extra set on one side? Where does the athlete feel themselves? What's their feedback, and where they feel they need to work on. So if someone might say, I need to work on a little bit more acceleration work, I just don't feel sharp over the first 5 yards, or I'm not fit enough. So we do a lot. We've got a more objective scientific side to things, but we really focus. I keep saying we because it's myself and Fran, who's the SC coach, and we've kind of built it together. We really focus on the holistic side, and particularly more this year, we tend to sit down and do a lot more player reviews. So show the athlete absolutely no data, sit down with them, ask them questions, don't talk, just listen, and see what they want and where they feel, because often they come up with all the answers that you have in front of you, more often than not, and then you might guide them one or two ways by adding in something that you feel they've missed or you feel is a big area for them to work on, and then give them one or two focuses, because we can't work on everything at the same time all the time, and they're not going to all be the best at everything. So again, it comes back to like exams we've done in the past, and if it's a body composition issue or they need to be leaner, if they just improve that in the next block, that's probably going to go a long way. But getting it to come from them, I find, is a lot more powerful, because they've come up with the idea, they've committed to their goals, they've said what they're going to do over the next 6 weeks. They know there's a review in the next 6 weeks. It's not about catching them out, but they've set out those goals themselves. So now they've taken ownership, they're part of the plan, and then you're there to facilitate, and whoever that is, the football coach, the S&C, the physio, you should be not an expert, but you're there to program and guide and help program it, but you shouldn't be there to motivate them every step of the way. That should come from the athlete, and I think that's the piece that I feel is missing at times. People are great sometimes at understand the data inside out, but does the athlete get to that goal by the end of your next review, if you even have a review? Because if you just have that one review and they improve that one thing over the season, that could be more powerful than all this data you have in front of you. So that holistic piece for me, again, it ticks that like communication piece, the soft skill side of things. Go and meet them away from where they normally have a meeting. Sit outside if it's a nice day, have a coffee with them, get to know them, make it a relaxed atmosphere. But then set really, really clear goals that they've come up with, and come up with ways to measure their goals. So we actually use I don't know if you know that kind of GROW model. Yeah, so it's like goals, reality, opportunity, and will. And we kind of started using that model to, I suppose, just use questions and listening as a way of motivating or getting them to be accountable.
What you're saying is, I'm actually writing a paper tonight around self-determination theory and how physical activity leads to better mental health, and self-determination theory is the big driver of that. But you're touching on all the exact aspects there now. Giving the players autonomy around choosing their own goal, I think, is so important, because when they own that themselves and they've identified it themselves, they're so much more likely to want to achieve it than you telling them. Just on those reviews, how often, or in around like general bandwidth, are you looking to have those?
So at the minute we're looking at 4 times a year, and probably fits in with our testing battery of pre-season, early end of pre-season / start of the season. We look at one in around Christmas period, where you're kind of, I suppose, mid-season, and then we look at one we call kind of, I suppose, it's that last block of the season. leading into the off season. So they all have a different focus. Pre-season, you have obviously got a certain type of goals, it's a different period of time. Then you're into your competitive phase, and you want to review how things have been going and what's we're halfway through the season, how things went, what can we improve, and then at the end of the season you're looking at that last little bit and how we're going to then, I suppose, program their off-season programs. So people could argue you could go more, you could go less. It's realistic at the minute. It does take time. You've got a lot of things going on each day, and sit down with each player individually. It takes time, but it is worth it. So yeah, 4 times a year is what we're looking at the minute.
Is that largely from a physical standpoint, or are you interacting with manager, technical, tactical coaches to give them maybe 3 goals that come from different brackets, or is it you and Fran largely from the S&C department that are working through that?
Yeah, so it's a good question. We actually had a meeting the other day, and we've got an IDP coach in now called Leanne Hall, and her role is ultimately about individual development from a football side, but she's created like an IDP model, and her model is to join them all together. So if I sit down with a player, I should know in front of me on the screen before I talk to the player what their football goals are, it might be specific old injury, prehab or whatever you want to call it with the physios. It could be psych, as long as it's not too sensitive. So we're all across the same things, and the players can see that it's collaborative and it all fits into the manager's model and ethos. But our physical models are based off, I suppose, general S&C principles, but also off the manager's model and his philosophy and way of playing. So there is a natural tie-in, I suppose, but it's also, we're trying to bring that piece together where when the player talks to me and I talk to the player, they've sat down and went, oh, Owen's already across my football goals and this and that. We can focus on what my physical goals are with him, but he understands the rest of the context and the picture.
It's good from your point there, and that one, you're not overloading them with too many physical goals, and they may already have a few other ones there, but also the player can see the collaborative approach. That like, if you want me to make more tackles in a game, and you're saying improve my body composition, well, it might be easier for me to get around the field to make those more tackles. Just to give an example that way. I'm going to guess now that he possibly started doing the physical ones earlier in time, because they're easier to get a specific measure and set a kind of a goal, whereas particularly some of the more tactical ones, they can be very difficult to actually define and say, did you meet that or not?
Definitely, yeah. I think they're naturally a bit more objective, and I think that the football department, because we've got a designated person to IDP, they do a lot more reviews on the football side of things, so their cycle, and because realistically physical adaptation takes potentially that little bit longer, and we're not testing them every single week, so they tend to do a lot more reviews throughout the year. They're a bit more consistent, or not consistent, they've more contacts with them, I suppose. So we just thought this is our most realistic time frame in terms of actual change, and we feel it's a realistic time frame for us given the other work that we have on day to day. We don't want to commit to something that we can't deliver, because I think that's the worst thing you can do for a player. If you sat down and set out all these goals and then you can't make a review, or work gets on top of you. So we want to master this model first and review it next year. We've got that kind of, our model is plan, do, review and refine. So we do that with everything we do, weekly, monthly, annually. So at the end of next year we'll look back and say, right, was four reviews enough? Was it too much? Did it work practically? What did the players think themselves? Get feedback from that side of things, and then modify and change if we need to.
The 4 sounds quite realistic and achievable, especially the way you have them spaced out like it does. It makes sense there, but again, obviously it's important to review. Just I'm conscious of your time now. Briefly, the last thing I want to touch on was, you mentioned you came from very much a technical, tactical background yourself, coaching the sport itself, and you would have worked in that sense in some way. Like chatting to a few other coaches we've had on, they found it, like Orla Curran when she was on, worked largely with hockey and rugby and knew nothing about either from when she started, but learned a lot more and it helped. Coming from like a reasonably strong soccer, and you've done your UEFA B background, has that helped you? But also in other ways, have you had to like kind of compartmentalise? For a while now, I just need to switch off what's happening here in the soccer and focus on the physical and not be distracted by it, because I know for me that happens an awful lot when it comes to hurling.
Yeah, I think has it helped me? 100%. Like, I think my last 2 jobs that I've got at interview stage, I definitely found the coach's interest peaked when they, I suppose, knew I had my UEFA B. Probably I could speak football language to them within the interview. I could contextualise things from questions they'd ask me. It made them feel comfortable and maybe trust me a little bit more. I wasn't this kind of like completely different person. I kind of, could cross over into their area. So I think that helped. Like, I think particularly in sports, probably like yourself, I said hurling and football, they're quite tactical, and I think coaches find comfort in that. I think with players and staff ongoing, like, again, that common language, being able to just understand, different tactical components when you're talking to a player, even if it's relative or not, they buy into it, I feel. And this isn't me saying that if you don't come from those backgrounds, you can't work in those sports. You absolutely can, and we need diversity, I suppose. And but it does really help you understand context a little bit more, and even like warm-ups and return to play. Like, you'll get managers who say, I want a ball in my warm-up, or this day you've got to be able to put this in, or if it's return to play, work, and you can bridge that gap before they get back to the team with physical and football principles. Like, I think straight away you probably become a little bit more attractive to a football manager, or most football managers within the game of football. It might be different in other sports, but I can only speak from my own experiences. So I think it's really, really helped. And my last 3 or 4 jobs, in fact probably all my jobs in football, they've wanted an element of me being able to take a component with a ball. But I also think it's very important to know your own role, and you're not the expert in the football field, and that's not what you're employed to do, and I don't think the player should see it as that either. So I will always try to not get involved with too many conversations that are primarily tactical and technical, and almost promote yourself more as whatever you want to call it, strength and conditioning coach or athletic development, or because they need to buy into that first and foremost, because ultimately you're not going to be sitting down to review different areas like that with the players. So I think almost understanding what your role is also very important, and not going too far in or giving too many opinions on the game itself, even if you know or think you know what you're talking about. And then you ask, kind of, do I find it hard to distance myself from it? Yeah, I think you definitely, like you said, you definitely always analyse the technical side, naturally, probably subconsciously, in one sense. If you played it, you studied it. I'm a fan. I'm still a massive fan of the game. When I'm not working in it, I'm watching it. So I think you do analyse it, but I've felt I've done it less in the last couple of years, because I've just focused so much on improving as a practitioner in my own field that I've almost enjoyed sometimes not analysing it as much, just watching a game for it being a game. So yeah, I suppose a bit of a yes and a bit of a no.
Yeah, no, it's a hard one to say, because obviously the background in the sport, when even do you follow some form of tactical periodization model at Arsenal? Like, if a manager's outlined to you, we're going to do these type of games or this bit of the game form, if you can understand it, you're like, oh grand, I know how to complement that physically. He doesn't need to give you this real detailed breakdown. That's a huge help. And you touched on the return to play stuff there, and adding the sport in is absolutely huge for stuff like that, and that makes a massive difference. Because we've had, say, my own club physical coaches in the past who know absolutely nothing about the sport, but try and include it, and everyone is looking at each other with eyes raised, like, what is he doing here? And that's a great way for people to lose confidence in you. So I think if you don't know the sport, don't try and know it too early, but if you do, implement it where possible, but don't lose sight of what the end goal and what your specific role is.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you plant me in rugby tomorrow, I'm not giving myself a good sell here for an interview, but if you plant me in rugby tomorrow, I'd be out of my comfort zone in that area, like in the area of, I suppose, tactical periodization, or designing small sided games, and it would be something I'd have to develop and learn, because it wouldn't come naturally to me. Whereas, as you said there, hurling's your background, you've played it for years, you understand it. You just feel comfortable almost suggesting different things, and just I think talking their languages is huge. Like, you know, when a coach comes in from a different sport by how they, football and soccer, it might be a transition, and they might call it a turnover, and straight away different things like that can highlight those areas, and it's not an issue. That's the thing, but we're being really honest and realistic. The manager finds comfort in it.
When you did the UFB, is there much physical on that, or is it nearly all technical, and the physical is just kind of, a nearly a separate pathway, or do you touch on it a bit there?
No, so there is a physical component, and I don't know if you know, like Raymond Verheijen's model.
Oh yeah.
So Raymond Verheijen's model.
Football actions,
yeah. So, to be honest, my opinion is that everyone should read Raymond Verheijen's book if you work in football. Everyone shouldn't take every little detail from it, but I think it's definitely well worth the read, particularly if you've come from a background outside of football. Open your mind to it. I definitely don't follow all his principles, or wouldn't be as black and white in terms of that tactical periodization model, but I've taken things from it in regards to small-sided games and different elements like that. So, and again, certain managers you work with, they might operate completely off that model. So if you don't understand it, you can't even rationalise why you're against it. You need to be able to read the book, and I always think with any of these, I think we've become an industry that we talk people down. We tend to sit on one extreme or the other. So, like, I suppose if you've got Raymond Verheijen on one side and very much tactical periodization, and you've got very isolated running on the other side of things, like, I don't think we should ever sit in one extreme. Like, we need to sit in the middle, or the left or right or centre, and be able to, understand both, and then fit that model into the manager's philosophy. Because you don't have those, you don't make those decisions all the time. So you have to be able to adapt and educate, and if you understand both sides, you can educate more, and eventually you might bring that coach further the other way, or the other way. So I find it frustrating when I hear coaches, I suppose, completely dismiss something, and they haven't actually read the material. But it's not a plug.
Yeah. Oh no, I completely agree. Like, I read that. I read Tony Strudwick's Soccer Science, Vladan Jovanovic's HIT running, I can't remember the name of the book, and looked at Martin Boucher and Paul Larson's HIT science book, and find that middle ground kind of somewhere in between the four of those, and apply it across the hurling. Like, in my head, you have your hurling actions, so to get them fit specifically for hurling actions, they have to do them in some form of games at varying intensities, but sometimes we need to support all that with a little bit of isolated running based on the stage of the season, what way the week or month is going, all like that as well. Absolutely brilliant point. I think that's where we'll wrap it up there now. I've taken enough of your time. If you've anything to plug, or if anyone wants to get in contact with you to follow up on any, you hear some absolutely brilliant information there. If anyone wants to follow up on any of that, where could they possibly hit you up or anything like that?
Yeah, I suppose Twitter's probably the main one. I'm not overly active in terms of I don't do a huge amount of tweeting or anything like that, but I more like follow practitioners and different people in the industry. Tweet the odd thing, and I think my Twitter is literally my name, which is Eoin Clarkin, Eoin Clarkin. So I think that's my Twitter handle. If it's not, you might have to do a little edit. And no, thanks for having me on. Brilliant to chat, John, and I'm really loving listening to your podcast as well.
Oh, sound, yeah. You're saying all the right things there. No, thanks a million for coming on today. It was absolutely excellent, and I really appreciate that.